There we go. Welcome back to the Context Coaching Podcast. We are joined today from Des Moines. Probably said Des Moines wrong, but we're going to go with it. With Laura Nguyen, who is an author, speaker, executive coach, whose primary focus is the career break or pause so that we can avoid burnout and stay passionate about what we do. So, Coach, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Justin. And you did say Des Moines right. So yes. The S is silent. You're good.
Love it. So it's like Illinois. There we go.
Indeed. Indeed.
So we talked briefly, and as we discussed, my traditional audience, coaches, athletic directors, athletes, things like that. And your background or not with athletics, but can you talk a little bit about how you landed where you are today, post corporate career, into this new endeavor, so that we can set the audience up for what's going to be a fascinating and enlightening discussion?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So as we talked about, Justin, I've spent the last 18 years on the digital marketing side. I'd always been that high achiever through high school and college, just trying to accelerate my performance as much as possible. So how do I graduate, in 3 years from a bachelor's program with 2 degrees? How do I make sure that I accelerate my MBA program? And how do I make sure that I'm succeeding in every job that I had thereafter? And so, I'd been managing teams for essentially the last 15 years and have always been focused on performance and helping people really achieve their goals and their dreams as it relates to their careers as a whole. And in doing that, what I recognized for myself was that all of the habits and routines that I had put in place on overwork and deprioritizing myself, not taking care of my health, all caught up with me not that many years ago. And so ultimately what happened was I totally burnt out. And I decided that I needed to take an intentional time away from work to be more thoughtful about what do I want to bring into this world? What impact do I want to have that goes both within my day-to-day work, but also in my life? And so I talked to a ton of, other career execs who had spent a lot of time in their work and had taken time off themselves and asked them a lot of questions on what do they wish they would have done differently? What are things that they learned by taking some time off? And what were the outcomes from it? And so what I essentially built was a program that I put myself through and use myself as essentially the guinea pig. And then now today, I help people go through that same process. I have an online community, I have a course, and I do one-on-one coaching and group coaching for folks. I also am the founder of Soul Solutions, which is a marketing consulting practice. So I serve as a fractional marketing leader for several organizations and also coach their internal teams to maximize their growth and performance. And so it's been a really fun ride over the last few years after I took this intentional pause and pivoted my career, but still am able to use some of the foundational building blocks that got me here.
Can you do me a favor and talk a little bit about what you mean? And I missed the secondary term, but you said you're a fractional something in regards to this Soul Solutions organization that you have. And I missed that second term, but I have no idea what that meant.
Yeah. All good. Always check me on jargon. So that's all good because I've spent too much time in that corporate world. So it's a fractional marketing leader. So essentially a chief marketing officer for organizations. I focus on performance marketing and digital marketing. And so it's about how do I create the best strategy for them to help grow their business? What levers do we need to pull? What partners do we need to pull in? And how do I augment their staff to really drive performance?
Perfect. I'm thinking about it when you said you're part of that group, and I was like a fractional member of owner. I was like, was like a timeshare? But anyway, here's what I want to go back to and where we're going to dive into this deal, which is burnout, right? How do you reach that stage? What does that look like? What have you found to be the cause of it? Because when we were talking offline, you specifically shared that you loved your job, you loved what you did, and you still ran into that. And that's how I would say a lot of people in this audience profession probably run into that wall at some point, despite how much they love what they do. So share your learned wisdom on that topic.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of the times when people think about burnout, it typically is in one category, which is overwork. But actually, there are three categories that lead to burnout. The first one is overwork, which is what it sounds like, right? Which is the amount of hours that you're putting into the day, the amount of effort and energy you're putting into your work. And even that even goes into life. Like when we think about burnout, we often talk about it as purely a work thing, but it also goes into what about your role as a parent? What about your role as a spouse? What about your role as a caregiver? All of these areas also lead to burnout. So, one is overwork. The second is underchallenged, where you feel like you are doing the work, but you're not feeling like it's using your skills or your level of mastery that you've been able to grow and gain, right? You're like, I'm here, essentially, right? And then the other is neglect, where essentially when you're in an organization that just doesn't value, you feel like it doesn't value your existence being there. And so those are really the three core areas when we think about burnout is overwork, underchallenged, neglect. I think one of the other things, your other question around like what's kind of the path that drives you there. And there's typically 5 stages as it comes to burnout. And I think about it like you're taking a cross country drive and, at first, you're in the car, you buckle up your seatbelt. You're kind of excited. You're in this honeymoon phase. You're excited to be there. You're excited to jam out to your road trip music. And then all of a sudden, you're driving and it starts to rain. So then you have an onset of stress and you're like, all right, I got to turn the windshield wipers on. And now it's really pouring and I can barely see out the windshield, right? And so then you start to get this feeling of all this anxiety. You're white knuckling your steering wheel. And so that onset of stress kind of piles into more heightened stress, right? And so now you're having a lot of this overwhelm during this process. And then all of a sudden you have this little, you get to this point where you hear this little ping in your car and it's your check engine light. All right. Your check engine light comes on and you're like, oh crap. What am I supposed to do now? Do I keep driving or do I pull over and find a mechanic? And so then you're like, I can't, I'm gonna pull over. I'm gonna pull over to the mechanic. You pull over, you have the conversation, and you find someone that's gonna be able to take a look at your car. And they tell you that it's not gonna be until 3 days for that part to come in, which means you're stuck in this town, you have no idea where it's at. And that leads you to habitual burnout. Right. So you go through these processes, and typically when that check engine light comes on, is our signal that we don't really pay attention to. It's our body telling us that we need to take a slowdown. It's the GI issues, it's the migraines, right? It's those types of things that start to say, hey, let's pay attention to what's going on here and the impact of stress. But we don't pay attention to that check engine light. And you probably just blew past a few exits before you even pulled over. And that's what really leads us to this chronic burnout situation.
Yeah, and not even related to work. I would say most people are very familiar with that. I've been driving with my check engine light on for quite a while, to be honest with you. And that's just normal. And I'm not talking about the figurative, the literal check engine light is on in the car. So you should probably go get that checked. But going back to what we are talking about here, I want to go to these three concepts, right? Overwork, under challenge, neglect. And I want to talk about that in regards to, let's say, coaching in general, but let's just say life activity. And if you could dig in a little bit more on under challenged, firstly, and then as a follow up on neglect, because I think that could also be parsed into fractional thoughts of that, because there's also like underappreciated. You're not neglected, right? They're checking in, but maybe you feel, or your personality type is one that needs, more recognition, so to speak, right? So I'd love you to peel back the layers of those two a little bit more, just so I can conceptualize it, but also the coaches that are listening on to the show can understand how that translates to their particular discipline.
Got it. And so just one question, do you want me to talk about those areas as it relates to themselves or to the people they're coaching?
I'm a big fan of embracing the power of the word and. I'm not big on ors, so yes.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Thanks, Justin. Okay. So a few things. When I think about, specifically when I think about trying to understand and dissect those three core areas of burnout, what it really relates to, I think underlyingly at a foundational perspective, it comes down to understanding what your core values are. And that is both for the people that you're leading and coaching, as well as for yourself. And I think that becomes values misalignment is one of the core reasons for burnout. And so when you think about that, it's going through the exercise, right? I walk people through an exercise and I've got, free resources that I give to people all the time. That's like, here's your sheet of keywords around core values. Highlight the ones that resonate with you. Don't think about it. Just the ones that pop out, circle them, and we'll go from there. And then from that point, we say, how do we categorize them into 5 core areas, 3 to 5 core areas? Typically, what happens is they find related words that then they say, okay, this makes sense to me. And then from there, they pick one core value out of each of the columns. From there, when you're thinking about overwork, if you're really clear on your core values, then your ability to say no and set boundaries because your why that you are there for becomes more clear. When you're thinking about, under challenged, the question around why are you under challenged is related to, is there a values misalignment? If you really care about professional development, professional growth, for example, then are you looking for opportunities to continue to identify what are those 3 areas that you want to grow in and how are you seeking those out? Are you having the conversation with your team on how they can continue to grow themselves? And if you're thinking about the area around neglect slash underappreciation, then that probably for you likely is a core value of feeling appreciated and gratitude as a core value. And so typically what happens in that situation is if that is a core value for you, expressing gratitude, being the model for how you want other people to behave, typically also helps reciprocate. You're smiling, Justin.
Well, because I'm laughing because that reminds me of, say, the love language framework,
Mm,
which you just named. If a core value for you is appreciation and you start speaking from that lens, are you taking into account that that might not be the love language or the core value of that other person, right? And
yeah,
so while I think you're dead on, how do you then navigate when there
yeah,
isn't alignment between you and members of your team or the extended group that you work with?
yeah. I think to your point, appreciation means many things to different people. Okay. So, for some people, appreciation is monetary. For some people, appreciation is professional development. For some people, appreciation is verbal appreciation, right? For others, they might want public recognition. I think what it really comes down to, anytime you're leading and managing and coaching people, it's getting to know people at their core, right? Understanding what motivates them. How do they want to be appreciated? Asking those questions is really, really key to understand. It comes down to, even for my team, what I used to have is like a little sheet of paper, and I would ask them these cheesy questions, right? Of like, how do they want to be appreciated? What's their favorite coffee drink or beverage of choice? Or what's their favorite candy or snack? Like all of these things to get a better small things as well as larger things to understand what really motivates them. And so when something comes up and someone says being at their kid's activity is a core value and high priority for them, that it's immediately easy for you to say, go to that, don't think about it. And we'll worry about any outstanding projects when you get back.
Can you dig into that a little bit and just off the cuff? Hey, look, these are the things I would ask if I were framing this as a general data gathering document. So, for example, we will do something with my particular team that's kind of an interest inventory, right? And it's along those lines, right? And I am Doc. And so, if you could list, I don't know, 5 to 10 that you would use regardless of the industry the team is in, right? Because really it's to get
Yeah.
to know your people, Doc, just so
Yeah.
people can steal something right off the top and deploy this.
Yeah. I think so. So when you think about tangible questions to ask, right? Like on your toughest day, how would you want to be supported? Right.
That's
And
a great
then
question.
like after a win, how do you want to be celebrated? Like some people might want to like go out together. It might be different. It kind of just depends on what matters to them. And then I would think the other one would be name, you know, kind of going back to the core values, name 3 values that are of highest importance to you. And then now you have something tangible to say on good days, this is how I'm going to help this person. On a bad day, this is how I'm going to help this person. And in general, if something pops up, these are the areas I know I need to make sure to watch out for. I think one of the things that we struggle with, especially in a corporate environment at the same time, we forget that people are dealing with struggles and losses outside of an office and out and off the field, right? For for students, it could be, parents, divorces, all, siblings, like it could be anything, could be a bad breakup, like it could be any of those areas. And understanding you're as a coach, you're there both in their life, but also in their professional, or when you think about from an athletic perspective, careers as well. And so, in a way, our job is to help them manage through and develop a lot of that mindset and resiliency in life as well as in what they're doing.
No, that's a great model. And I think there's always this tension arc between how do you stay professional with your colleagues, let's say, right? And you have your boundaries and all of that. But then when you're leading and managing, it's like, how do you get to know your team while respecting those? And so I
Yeah.
think figuring out how to do that within the framework of whomever you're dealing with. So, like, for example, one of the challenges for me is like, look, I don't like hanging out with people in general. Like I like to be at home. I'm not going to the little faculty gathering. I'm more annoyed to be there. And at the same time, it deprives me of an opportunity to get to learn more about other people, right? That's my own
Mhm.
baggage and my own cross to bear. But it's like, okay, if you're wired like me, then what's another way to do those things? And a point of entry, which then maybe allows me to feel more comfortable at those events. Who knows? But I think that's a great offering for anybody, be it in sports or corporate leadership, like you said. Um, when you step into a role, somebody brings you on to say an executive coach, right? And this would be coaches having coaches. What are the primary things that you're trying to tease out right off the bat so that you can better help walk alongside of that person that you're trying to serve?
Yeah, great question. So the first one's always what are their goals? What do they want to achieve in our 4 to 6 months together? Like that's really the first piece is understanding what do they want to make sure they're getting out of this engagement. The second is I typically go through a personal narrative. It's the only time I go backward. And what it does is it helps me understand how they're wired, how they talk about how they're wired, right? So I go from birth to present day. Give me a view of what are your wins and losses over the course of your life and your career. Tell me about you. And what it does is it immediately helps us build rapport, but it really gives me an understanding of what are some of their mental models and what are potentially limiting behaviors and beliefs that they have that we need to work on. So we take their goals, we take those limiting beliefs, and then we say, what's our game plan to helping achieve their goals by breaking down and learning new habits and routines to have them honestly build more confidence around those limiting beliefs.
Perfect. So let's dive into that idea
Yeah.
of a limiting belief, how they play out in your day to day,
Hmm.
and how people can potentially try to identify those on their own, right? What does that question framework look like once you have their story, right? And you're now analyzing, all right, here's something that it seems like is limiting you, right? How does that whole thing play out? Because not everybody's going to have the luxury of like, let me call up Laura, let me spend time with her, and so how is there a hack for this, right? That's not as in depth as you would go, but something that somebody that's maybe struggling with the imposter syndrome or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So a couple things. Typically, a lot of the folks I work with, there's like 2 ways that they're thinking about it, which is one is guilt, right? Like I feel, let's take the example around career breaks or taking time away from work. A lot of it comes down to guilt. I'm worried that I'm not being the best person for my family. I'm worried I'm not going to financially be able to provide. I'm worried that if I do this, I'll never be able to get back on the horse, right? I'll never be able to find another job again. Those are typically some of those limiting beliefs. A lot of the times, what that comes down to is lack of confidence, a feeling like they can't achieve what they want to achieve. So they feel stuck. And so when we go through the process of trying to help them unpack those areas, as a coach, and probably as you see it too, which is, having it come from them typically is much better, right? Because that helps create a catalyst for change. But the truth is that as we go through typically a personal narrative exercise, I will ask them what themes are they seeing throughout their roles, throughout their academic, experience, throughout their experience in sports, and have them articulate that. And there will be a light bulb moment as they're articulating that process. So those are, that happens in a one-on-one engagement. So Justin, in engagements where I also have engagements where I basically give people a roadmap and it's a do-it-yourself model, and then we check in virtually. So in those models, what typically happens is I have them journal it. Like journal for me each stage of your life and then highlight what are the key themes from there. And then from there, they clearly identify and can articulate, here are my wins and here are my losses, right? And here's why. So then the next stage I have them typically go through is, what did you learn from this experience? What are you going to take with you to your next, stage of your season of your life? And what are you going to have to let go of to be able to become the person that you want to be?
Well, diving into what you said just about where this often ends up is guilt about stepping away, taking time off, falling behind, which
Mm-hmm.
seems to be, as we discussed pre-recording, more prevalent in society than it was when I was growing up, and specifically in athletics. And what I shared with you about the youth sports industrial complex creating this fear of missing out, and if I'm not doing this year round, then I'm going to fall behind. And I mean, it can cross pollinate across any industry, obviously, but
Mm-hmm.
specifically in sports. How would you push back against that narrative? And I will share with you, not for me, because I revel in the fact that I'm a seasonal coach at this point in my life. But 15 years ago, we were playing 325 days a year. And it was, hey, if we don't do this, like we're falling behind. And we had a ton of success. We had a ton of athletes go on to play at the next level, right? You get your tangible outcomes. But at the same time, it's, to your point, it's not sustainable. Does it work for everybody? Are you really separating, or are you just reinforcing the spin, right? And the consistent buildup of things that aren't real. So anyway, point being is, if you are currently stuck in that pattern, and you believe deeply like this is the only way to do it, right, where you were at one point, like what gave you the freedom and the power to step away and realize, actually, I didn't lose anything by doing this. And from my standpoint, like ultimately, we were just as successful over the last 4 years by playing from November to February as we were had we played year round all those years ago.
Mhm, mhm. So two things. One is, let's use a sports analogy since we're talking to coaches. So when we think about, when athletes are in high fatigue, the chance for injury is way higher. When we think about maximizing gains, we have to make sure we're resting. Like, I feel like in athletics, it almost is more natural to have rest days, right? And you're baking that into a program. But yet, in other areas of life, and maybe what you're saying here too, which is it doesn't become natural to us to give ourselves the permission to rest and recover. Even though we know we need to do it, we feel like we have to keep hustling and grinding. And I did the same thing. I did the same thing, for a dozen and a half years. And had it not been for probably a couple reasons, right? Which is the the lingering question of, what the hell am I here for? Like, why do I, this existential question of, what are we doing all of this for, was really, really key. And where the catalyst for that happened for me was I had a loss. Someone on my team had passed away from cancer. And we were about the same age. We have kids the same age. And it becomes a real mortality reality, right? That if we continue at this pace, our teams will replace us tomorrow, but our families can't replace us. Our kids can't replace us in their lives, right? And so it became a huge question for me of what purpose do I want to serve in this world, and how am I aligning my values to my actions? And the truth was I wasn't at all.
And so how did you make that shift, and what does that look like since you have done so? I mean, obviously you're still
Uh,
working on putting this thing together, big picture that serves others. But, what empowered you to take that leap of faith, and what are the positives and some of like the maybe things that didn't go as well as a
yeah.
result of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of what, the leap of faith and what the prep work was for that, I mean, I would say it was an 18-month journey for me to make sure that I had the financials to go through the process to take some time off. But honestly, most of it was the confidence, Justin. Like I didn't have like those core beliefs in myself that I could do it. But I had this desperation of it had to be something else. I had to figure out another way. And so, I created this, I did a ton of research, like I shared, I pulled together this plan. And what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to do a month of play. I'm going to do a month of pause, and I'm going to do a month of plan. That's my structure for how I approached it. And the reason I did that was when you think about the science around neuroplasticity and the science around burnout, what it comes down to is injecting more joy into our lives was really key. And then there's a ton of research right on the benefits of mindfulness and meditation, which I couldn't go 5 minutes without meditating before this. And so I knew I needed to do something to essentially shock the system. And then I gave myself permission then in month 3 to say, how do I plan out? What is this going to look like? That's when I did a ton of journaling, a ton of exercises. I met with a ton of people to help work me through the process of what are career opportunities, what are paths that I want to explore. And then after that is when I moved on to pursue. You had a second question I want to make sure to answer. The good and the bad,
Correct.
right? Okay.
Yes.
The good is, I think during some intentional time off, and it's intentional time off that you can actually infuse into your day-to-day life. It doesn't have to be 3 months off. It can be in making sure that, once a month on a long weekend, you're spending time being thoughtful about what you want to do. That for me has become a habit. So now I have play, pause, and plan scheduled throughout my calendar every week. And what it does is it's a reminder for myself of what do I want to make sure I am focusing my effort and my energy, and making sure that I have enough, right, gas in the tank for myself and for everyone else. Um, the other good that came from it is I felt really alone in my process. And so, meaning I felt really alone in burnout, right? Like I didn't have anyone I could really talk to about it. And when I started sharing a lot of my content on LinkedIn last year, it just blew up. I think I had 5 million impressions within the first month. Like I got 2,500 direct messages from people. I talked to about 200 people in a 2.5 month time period who were all struggling with the same thing. And that really became the catalyst for the online community that I have, because I was like, I don't want people to feel alone in this, that this struggle isn't something that they have to do on their own, that we can help support and guide each other along the process. Um, the bad, right, in this new endeavor, when you talk about some of maybe the opportunities or the learnings, is it never stops. So I run my own business now. I have my consulting side, I have my coaching side, I build digital products. I have a book launch coming out in October. So I'm a busy person. I've loved that. Like it is in my DNA to be a high achieving high producer. It is something I have to continuously unlearn in a lot of ways and give my permission and grace to take a pause. And so a part of me going through this journey as well is a continuous reinforcement, right, of why all these areas are super important. And the life that's lived today is way more intentional than it was before.
So go back to this idea of I took a month of play, a month of pause, a month of plan. What does that look like for somebody that has no idea what you mean by that?
Yeah, yeah. So when we think about the science around play, what often happens, right, is that, and think about it as, let's talk about it from a sports point of view. Sometimes when, let's say you're, playing soccer or playing tennis, and the joy of just being out on the field, there's just the smell, the sense, the full sensory experience. You lose track of time and you're just enjoying being there in the moment. But the second that you have to start thinking about like volleying the ball back, or feeling like you're gonna, like, making sure you don't trip or making sure you don't miss a score, right? Like all of these things, you get in your own head and you get in your own way. And so the concept around play is being in flow, and that allows you to have more creativity. It allows you to be in a state of joy at the end of the day. And there's a whole bunch of science around the act of play. Typically, what happens is adults, we forget to play. Somewhere along age 10, we get worried about judgment and we focus more, and that's where our focus goes instead of the act of actually just playing. And so when you think about play, there's a whole bunch of archetypes around what type of play you might lean toward. But it could be playing sports. It could be maybe playing a different sport like, frisbee golf or something. Or it could mean going to a comedy show. It could mean going to the theater. It could mean a whole bunch of different types of facets of play. But it's about, what I typically have folks do is write down 10 things that you really love doing maybe as a kid, and then schedule it. Just do those things. And so play typically is also in the company of other people and being in relationship with other people. So there's an enjoyment piece there. Pause is a similar thing to your point. Like we go down the process, you brainstorm 10 ideas around pause. It could just be walking in nature. And then you go down the process of, okay, I'm going to schedule it. I'm going to get it done.
So then what does plan look like?
Yeah. Plan is a structure around, we think about, that's when we start to really articulate, here's what our core values are. And that's getting alignment around those areas. And then in there, especially for people who are exploring what a potential next career pivot for them would look like, I have them go through a matrix that has them map out all of the ideas of what are opportunities they've wanted to explore. It could be opening a new business. It could be pivoting completely to a different career. It could be whatever it might be. It could be a travel blogger. I don't care. So then what we do is we take that list of, let's say, 20 ideas, and we score them based on alignment with their core values, alignment with their inherent strengths, what's the revenue upside potential, what's the cost structure, right? And what's the level of difficulty for us to execute that in, let's say, a 3 to 6 month period.
And then you said that now I schedule this stuff in weekly.
Yeah.
So again, what does that look like for somebody that's, say, a teacher, somebody that is working in corporate America? Give me a few examples of how people can apply just conceptually
Yeah.
this regrounding with who we once were.
Yeah. So what I typically do is every week, we have this list of 10 ideas of things for play, right? Like schedule it in your calendar. If you have a weekend, today, is, let's say, Thursday, what can you do on Saturday that will bring you some joy? And it could be big or small. It doesn't have to be huge. Let's say, for example, you want to take a trip to Australia. If that's the case and you want to schedule a trip to Australia, go through the process of planning that out. Sometimes there's joy in just the planning out process of a trip like that. The same thing for pause. So pause is, there's specific exercise I had people go through that can be daily exercises if they so desire, or we can do an end of week exercise where we go through gratitude practices, right? Or journal prompts that they actually can go through. And then typically on a quarterly basis, I have people go through and just gut check their core values. I think it's really important. We're in different seasons of our life. So let's just validate, hey, how are we doing in this season? What's important to me right now? And that's how I'm going to be able to make decisions.
Yeah, and I love that you just said that, because there's an age and stage that I think sometimes we forget about. And even the phrase you just used, different seasons of our life. And I think often, especially, I feel like you're probably the back end, and I'm kind of towards the back end of the generation of, like, you go get a job and you do that for 40 years and then you hang it up, right? And then my children who are in college and the last ones in high school are in the kind of middle of this new regime of like, yeah, I'm gonna work for a year and then go do something else and like not feel bad about it, right? And so it's like dive into that a little bit. And I'm looking at something you wrote about sabbatical versus career break, or when you just talked about planning, maybe a career pivot. Like, how does all that come together, right? And
Yeah.
land in kind of that combustible moment, let's say.
Yeah. So I think you bring up a really great point in terms of the belief that careers are a trajectory, right? I think, and I ascribe to that as well. I mean, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would be talking to you about what's my career trajectory look like. Um, and I think the reality is that it is way more winding than that, right? Where you think about the number of layoffs that have happened this year alone in the hundreds of thousands, and the number of people impacted by reductions in force. I think there's that piece of that where there has been a shift generationally because the challenge around loyalty has been questioned when you've been laid off from 3 different companies in the course of a 10-year career. And I've talked to so many people who've had that experience. And so I think the reality is people have to be more thoughtful and intentional with themselves about what's the life and career they want to have. And that it doesn't make you a bad employee to have your own plan. It actually makes you a great employee to have your own plan. My favorite direct reports were ones that said, here are my goals, Laura. And my answer to that was, how do I help you achieve them here or elsewhere? Right. And so I think that's the key. So I think one of the other interesting things is there's a study that came out that talks about the number of millennials who intend to take a career break, and it's 84%. And that number shocked me. And, if you had asked me, like I said, 5 or 10 years ago, I would have said that I would never have been in that percentage point, right? The number of people who were in a break or planning to take a break, that wasn't there. And I think for some people, some breaks are by choice, some are by circumstance. I consider a layoff a career break by circumstance. Some are also those who are taking care of their family members, right? And especially in COVID, there were a ton of folks who took some time off to take care of family members. And so I think that's where we have to think about it as recognizing what are the priorities that we have and how does work in our careers play a role in that.
All right, this question is probably going to go against what you preach, but I'm asking anyway because I'm very curious. When that number's shocking, right? 84% of millennials are planning to take a career break, where, like you said, that's not even something that would have ever entered my mind in regards to planning for that. Like you said, circumstantial things that happen, yeah, right. That's part of like what I witnessed, my parents, my own career, etc. But to plan for it, it's just a very different mindset. So those of us that grew up in my era, whatever endpoints you want to put on that, and this isn't the get off my lawn moment, but it is very much a how do we find alignment with that other generation that sees the world very differently, when, as an educator, consistency matters in regards to culture, core values, mission, and vision. And when you are trying to not necessarily have people be loyal, because I don't think that's the right word, but have I'm going to get to it, but when you're having to restart every 2 years because somebody leaves, right? That impacts the students that you're serving, right? The athletes that you are serving. So how would you build consensus with that group that isn't wired to stick around in the way in which it most benefits the kids? I'll say the organization, but our job is to help these kids grow, right? How do you market? You were in marketing, right? How do you help them understand that, yeah, there's value in doing something and building some consistency, and your planned break, maybe it can be after 5 years instead of 1.5, right? So again, I'm throwing a lot at the wall here because I don't really know how to frame it, But what we're seeing is people coming into the profession, it feels like they're not willing to battle through the bumps and bruises as you are in early career. But given the percentage you just spoke to, it's more than that, right? It's not just that they're pulling the ripcord, it's that ultimately their mentals are just different in regards to what they're pursuing. So hopefully you can take something from that and give some feedback to us.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really valid question because there's so much to unpack in it, right, Justin? Like, I think there's a few things to talk through, which is, I think systemically there's an issue when we think about the canary in a coal mine, that when the canary comes out full of soot, like, who do we blame? Do we blame the canary for being sick, or do we blame the environment? And so I think there's some macro factors that dramatically impact the generational shifts. When you talk about wages, per inflation perspective, when you think about layoffs that we talked about, where it becomes so normalized now, um, it becomes a challenge, I think, also. And then the other component to that is the impact of social media and the impact of stress and anxiety that continues to skyrocket, right? 77, I think 77% of people have experienced burnout. And so, or are currently experiencing it right now. And I think I did a study and I asked people, how many of you have thought about quitting your job in the last 6 months? And it was 47%. And you think about half of the people who were surveyed in the US and Canada are saying that they are burnt out and they've thought about leaving their job. That it becomes a question of, how do we help manage retention within an organization? I think that's really kind of the root of what you're asking.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask. Thank you for your tactfulness.
All good, all good. And I think it comes down to a few things. One is, I think organizationally, we talked about, do the values of the person align with the values of the organization? That's key and first and foremost. The second becomes, the majority of managers who become managers have never actually been trained to be managers. And that impacts people's lives. Actually, the number one person who impacts your life more than your doctor is your manager. Managers can make or break your life and your career and your day. And so I think that it becomes a huge challenge of, how can organizations truly train managers to be effective managers for the people they lead? And it's the same thing around coaching, right? You think about, like, how did you learn to be a coach? Typically it's modeled by other people who were your coach. You learn their good, their bad, their habits, their models, whatever it might be, you turn it into your own, but you're using learned lived experiences to inform your coaching. Some people have had, I've had really great mentors in my life, and I appreciate that, because I feel like without their modeling, my management style would have been very different. And so, but I've had also managers who had their own challenges, right? Like, I've had the other side of that experience. So I think organizations need to train their managers to deal with the structural systemic issues that are making that canary sick. And so I think that becomes kind of the biggest challenge of, how do we help organizations do that in the most effective way?
Yeah, that's such a good answer. And because you asked the question, I would say, yeah, good mentors and lots of fumbles and failures in a way in which it wasn't catastrophic and you could still pick yourself up and keep moving.
And a psychologically safe place to have stumbles. That's the biggest one. I mean, you just brought it up, which is the environment and is the leader that you have willing to let you fall, right? And give you guardrails and catch you and coach you through that experience. And some aren't, right? People don't feel psychologically safe, and then that causes more stress and anxiety, and then they deal with the other challenges of burnout.
Yeah, and this goes all the way back to what you said 30 minutes ago, which is, when I have people take me through their personal narrative, right? So you can figure out what their limiting beliefs are. And some of that has to do with their unwillingness to fail, or their unwillingness, or not even unwillingness. That's not even fair, because that implies that it's intentional, right? And yeah, it's just built in, whatever they're carrying, right? And it gets in the way of that success. All right, I have one more question, and we've been on for a while, and I want to be respectful of your time. And like you did before, by reframing what I was actually asking into a really good question. When you have measured yourself for all intents and purposes based on outcomes, right? And similar to what you described, right? High achiever, got my degree in 3 years, got my MBA right away, promotion, 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 right? And all of your feedback that you find validation in that moment, whatever that happened to be, right? And it's not necessarily you, but people, right? The generalist term. If it's all these external objective metrics, right? I won X number of games. I've won this championship. We built into this. And there's no guarantee that that stays, or you're finally at this point where you're questioning the value of those things, and you're really starting to understand that process and habits are much more important than perfection, right? And the progress that you're making, right? And all the cliche buzzwords, all of that stuff. But when you're at that moment and it's the tipping point for you professionally, and you just can't get yourself there, even though you know, like, that's where you need to go, what's the hack to help people get pushed through that resistance?
Yeah. I think it's a great question. I think back to Clayton Christensen's book, and I think he has a speech too that it's all about how will you measure your life? And he had gone through what would be arguably an extremely professional, like successful professional career. And I think what you have to get clear on, especially with the folks that I work with as well, is we typically have these badges of honor that are titles, wins, salaries, right? Like it's the financial, those, to your point, those tangible things that you wear as badges of honor. But what happens is they're fleeting. They actually have no real value underneath of it. Like think of the number of CEOs or professional athletes that have been so successful in their careers, but you can sense there's an emptiness that's on the other side to it. And it's about how will you measure your life? What's the person that you want to be remembered for, of how you treated other people, about, what is the impact you actually wanted to make on this world and the people that you might want to help lift, right? So for me, my goal is like, how do I help, 1,000 people find more purpose and meaning in their life? And that would feel good to me. But at the end of the day, even if it's 5 people, 1 person, I'll feel pretty good. Um, I think the ones that I'm most thankful for are, who I am as a mom. Like that is really important for me. And the people who I surround myself with. Like I'm really grateful for a great family. I'm really grateful for, I think about, you were talking about in your reviews, what you had, the reviews that I got across my professional career, accolades aside, was, you were the best manager that I had. And so I'm like, that to me is the highest kudos that I could get in being a leader, was how can I impact someone's life, not just at that office where we work together, but for the years beyond it.
That's great. That's super helpful. All right, I lied. One more question that I always like to get people's take on, and I stole this a long time ago from Dave Stahoviak, but it's, what have you most recently changed your mind on? And it's always one of these growth mindset pieces, right? So you're in this season of your life where you are figuring out how to help people understand that taking breaks is okay. But I used to be pretty dug in over here, and now I'm over here, and here's why, where it's this modeling of it's okay to change your mind. And you're not being hypocritical. Like, you've grown, you've matured, you've changed your mind. So anything,
Yeah.
parenting, professionalism, like whatever it comes front of mind for you on that, Laura.
Yeah. I would say the transition of thinking of freedom as financial freedom, and the shift to freedom as freedom of time, of that autonomy to choose how I spend my time now, is so different. So I think that to me was a huge mindset shift. What about you?
First of all, I just want to say I love that. And it's funny because I was talking to a couple of our athletes here. I'm pointing over here on my couch, where they were in this predicament of, hey, my coach wants me to go do this. I'm also committed over here. And I was actually talking to them about time, right? Time is your only non-renewable resource. And, you can get a new job, you can get new money, you can, all these other things you can lose, but you can't get time back. And
Yeah.
so when you said that, it made me smile because it's something that we don't always remember, but it's been front of mind for me for a while. And I actually just answered this on the episode we just dropped, and I talked about international travel and that it's not something that I had ever done, and I started doing it. But I think it'd be redundant for me to give the same answer. So let me think about that for a second, and then I will answer it after you talk about anything else you need to talk about in regards to your book, in regards to where people can find you, and different things that, part of your programming over the last, 2022 till now, so 2.5 years that you've now developed that can help people, right? What does it look like? How do people get involved? What services and opportunities do they have to work with you personally, as a group, whatever you want to share in regards to that, and then I'll think of my answer.
Okay, sounds good. Well, first, thank you for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. Folks can find me on LinkedIn. I'm probably most active on LinkedIn, Laura Nguyen, which I think the correct spelling will probably be in the show notes. And also, my book comes out October 22nd, Career Break Compass. There are tons of exercises. My plan was to create essentially a framework that is a guidebook for people to help them plan, take, and then re-enter the workforce after a career break. So basically everything I wish I had had that I have now created and produced and given to you. So that is going to be available in October. As a part of that process, Career Break Compass also will include a complete web app experience. So people will be able to have their own basically app to go through, and they can actually kind of guide themselves through that process. And we also have an online community. It's a completely free online community for professionals who are looking for tips and connections with others, who are burnt out but looking to help increase their overall life and career performance.
All right, there you have it. That's where you can go get involved with what Laura has to offer. So here's my answer.
Okay.
The idea of contribution, and by that, I have a tendency to flippantly throw around a term that's, blank is a non-contributor. And in regards to how I view that and what is front of mind for me and what I need to get done, right? And so having some conversations around that lately, with people that I work for and with, in regards to, contribution doesn't always have to look the same, right? So somebody that's contributing in this space, right, is going to naturally be more identifiable for me than somebody that's maybe contributing in a different way. And for me, figuring out how to appreciate and value that in the same way without, I don't even want to say I disparage it, but it's just one of these things where there's the natural tendency of, are you doing more than your share, right? Or at least at a minimum, what your share is. And that contribution might not look the same for everybody because you may be less capable from a time standpoint, right? Because you're juggling young children or because you are giving in a different area. So I'd say I'm beginning to peel the layers of the onion back, on what that means. And part of that is me as an athlete and a coach, and super committed to culture, and where, from my standpoint and the mentorship and the organizations I'm around, where it's like, look, if you are not contributing, you are contaminating. And what does that mean? And there's a million ways to slice that, right? But from a coaching standpoint, right, if you're not in the drill and you're overshooting on a side basket, right, you may think that you're trying to work on your own deal, but you're taking away from the whole, right? And from a black and white standpoint, you are now a contaminator. From a gray standpoint, there's a whole different, there's a lot of nuance, right? And so trying to figure out, as a guy that lives in the gray, my own limitations in regards to the lens through which I see the world.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. I mean, I have a wonderful mentor, who was a great manager. Her name is Misty, and she had said to me really early in my career, it's always stuck with me. Just because you wouldn't do it that way doesn't mean it's wrong. And I was like, yep. And that's something that for her was something she had learned. So she kind of passed it on to me as well. And so I think it's about recognizing, to your point, what's everyone's contributions. And those contributions are going to look different for different reasons. And having the grace and appreciation for what they do contribute is really what's key.
Something I'm working on, but we're getting there. So anyway, thanks for being on. I appreciate the time I was able to spend with you. I really think as we were going into this and we were joking before we started, like, yeah, I don't know how this is going to work, but let's rip and run and see what happens. I honestly feel this has been one of the better offerings that we have for people that are listening. So
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you for having me. It's been super fun. Thanks, Justin.